Good evening. My name is Lisa Steele. I'm the artistic director at V.16, where we acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit River, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, which bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Welcome to the Curatorial Incubator version 16, Living in Hope, which is, I think, where we all are right now. Throughout the fall and early into 2021, we'll be hosting 8 different programs that respond to this theme, and we're halfway through now. Ivana Dizdar is our 4th program. At the conclusion of each curator's program, we post a recorded Zoom conversation between the curator and the artists. This evening, we're presenting this conversation between curator Ivana Dizdar and the artists Zack, Khalil, Akram Zaatari, Niklas Vollmer, and Laura Kissel. Sharif is unable to join us. Ivana.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you so much to all these wonderful artists joining us today. I'm so happy to have your videos in the program and to be able to speak with you and meet you, albeit over Zoom. It's still awesome to meet you, so thank you. I'll just say your names once more and you can just give a little wave to the audience so everyone knows who is who. So we have Zack Khalil. We have Akram Zaatari, Niklas Vollmer, and Laura Kissel. So I'd like to have you all start by briefly introducing your videos for people who may not have seen them or people who have. It's always nice to hear from an artist what their work is about. So let's start with Zack, and I'd ask you to just say a little bit about the history of the so-called Kennewick Man and your work more broadly.
Certainly. Hey, I'm Zack here. The film I'm presenting is The Violence of the Civilization Without Secrets, which takes as its subject what settlers and scientists call the Kennewick Man, and the people tend to refer as the Ancient One. The Ancient One is an ancestor discovered to be over 9,000, 10,000 years old in the Columbia River Basin. There's a long controversy that took decades where tribal representatives wanted to regain access to their ancestor so they could bury them. And they were fought kind of tooth and nail by scientists led by Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution, who wanted to maintain ownership of the Kennewick Man as an object of scientific study. And the project got started a really long time ago and was kind of inspired to produce this film that kind of sets the record straight based upon a 60 minutes piece that was produced in 1998 that was incredibly racist and misleading. So this film is a sort of a way of addressing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Akram's work also has to do with scientific versus non-scientific paradigms. So I'm interested to hear, Akram, how you would describe your work.
The time capsule in Kissel is, as a film, it is only a recording of the installation of the work being installed in a park in Kissel, and that was for the occasion of Documenta 12. Mm-hmm. Was it Documenta 12 or 13? I think 13 in 2012. And in this case, this is one of the rare works of mine where the film is not the end product. The work is there. It is in the park. It is a permanent piece that was commissioned by Documenta. And in this case, there is a reason why I circulate this piece alone, autonomously, because it's I've done a lot of digs in my work, some of them metaphorically, but some of them physically. They look like digging. The film in this house that is also in distribution is also about the story of an intervention. So I like to call those things interventions. And while digging somewhere in South Lebanon, I mean, I was looking for a specific letter that was meant as a time capsule. So I was revealing the letter. I was excavating that military object that contained a letter, an important letter for the person who wrote it.
And
Here,
excuse me. I was just going to ask you to also give some context for the viewers in terms of the work's relationship to the civil war in Lebanon and also the museum in Beirut.
Yeah. I mean, this has nothing to do with the museum, the work that's entitled in this house. But I'm just telling you that in my work, I very often create things to be revealed in the future, and at the same time, I look for things in the past. So I work like an archaeologist, but some archaeologists do time capsules too. But so I like to give work to future archaeologists as well. So this is on the level of the dig. But metaphorically, what I'm trying to say in time capsule Kissel is like not anything that you want to preserve might be turned accessible. So I'm trying to challenge the notion of access to everything. Some things can be ruined with access. So that's
a lot like the point that Zack is making, and in a very different way, Niklas and Laura are also somewhat excavationists or archaeologists in a different way who also reveal something with their work. So Laura and Niklas, why don't you tell us what it is that you reveal and maybe give us a very short history of the Falcon?
You go ahead, Laura.
Well, we were just on the phone before this Zoom session in order to revive our memories about the production of this short film. And it was made probably 12 or 13 years ago, I think, is that right?
Yeah.
And it was produced in 1 week, well, maybe less than a week, maybe 5 days time as part of a documentary contest. We are both professors of film and media at universities in the South, and this contest just so happened to coincide with, I think, our spring breaks. And so we said, yeah, hey, why don't we do this? This will be fun. The International Documentary Challenge is what they called it. And so people signed up from, lots of different places. And on, I think, the Friday or the Thursday night, you were given a theme. And we think maybe, a genre of documentary. So we received sports documentary and also a theme or a word. We can't remember, but it's either faith, the word faith and sports documentary, or it was nature and sports documentary. It's probably faith, Niklas.
That explains why you call it a part road movie, part nature documentary, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, all we had to go on was the genre that we were supposed to work in and this, theme or word to frame the story. And we had a very short amount of time to put this thing together. So, I went over to Atlanta where Nick lives, and we brainstormed a bunch of things, and on a whim, he had previously been up to this nature park and learned about the falcons and the tercel and the sort of gender concern or question around the bird and the naming of the Atlanta football team. And so we thought, let's just go with that and see. So we got in his car, his Toyota Tercel, and drove up there, and the story just unfolded from there.
That's awesome. Thank you. So very interesting and very different processes, but for me, these works also come together in a really interesting way. As you know, the theme of the program is uncovering, and the multitude of, things that uncovering can lead to, which can be good and obviously bad, as we've already mentioned in this so far very brief conversation. So Zack, I would really like to ask you about your research process. I imagine that you encountered a range of sources throughout your research, so information that was possibly incomplete, often biased, very conceivably often false. So I'd like to know how you navigated this range of evidence and testimony that have been certainly conflicting, and I'm sure there was a lot of, it was a huge challenge, so I'd love to hear about that.
Totally. No, it's a great question. And yeah, there's a lot to sift through. And it might be helpful to start with sort of how we're approaching the research in the first place and from what perspective. Both my brother Adam and I and Jackson collaborate on this film. We've also been working on a larger documentary film about repatriation of indigenous human remains. generally speaking, working closely with some of the members of our tribe in tribes in Michigan. So I think we had an eye towards all of the sort of research and facts that was more critical than most in terms of not taking some of that information at face value. This film also was originally commissioned for the Contour Biennial, and so it was supposed to be kind of created as something that functioned halfway between experimental film and almost like a Facebook educational video, something that gets this information across to a wider audience. So a lot of our research was actually, internet-based, especially because the Kennewick Man was such a huge controversy for such a long time. But besides the 60 Minutes piece, there's all sorts of other pieces about it on the internet from some more legitimate sources and more dubious sources. I think the research that spoke to us the most was there was many congressional panels actually even on the Kennewick Man himself and that whole controversy. And so hearing from the Umatilla and some of the tribes who would speak for on behalf of the Kennewick Man seemed to be the most relevant and powerful and interesting bits of the research. It's also interesting to think like things like that 60 Minutes piece, for instance. 60 Minutes, they often update their stories once there's been some things that have happened, some changes. And I thought it was interesting that this is one story that they decided to kind of just leave alone after they had gotten it wrong. And I think the other part of the research was thinking also, more academically about what this distinction really is, why indigenous human remains are treated as objects and not as subjects. And I think we were also really inspired by a Baudrillard essay, Ramsey in the Rosy Color Resurrection, which was about how scientists had been struggling to preserve Ramses after they had excavated him, and how he was sort of in the basement of some archive rotting away when there was already this sort of perfect funerary architecture in place in the pyramids that would have maintained him had they just had left it. That's a few of the different angles we pursued in terms of thinking about the bigger picture of the story.
Well, it's remarkable. Looking at your work, I always think about how much artists can be involved in scientific debates and all kinds of debates that are beyond the sort of discourse of art, quote unquote. So I wonder, it just occurred to me to ask you, you're an artist, of course, do you also consider yourself many different things or something in addition to being an artist and a filmmaker? How would you classify your role?
I think the emphasis is on art and filmmaking, and I think the ways that science intersects with that is always really interesting. And I think in some ways too, from like an Anishinaabe, my tribe's perspective and point of view, that I think the distinction between those things isn't necessarily as hard and fast as it might be in settler culture, and the way that those two sort of fields of inquiry can influence each other is really interesting.
I agree.
And just because
an artificial distinction.
Exactly. And just because of the way that science is so much actually tainted by a really specific worldview, whether it decides to sort of admit it or not. And one other just interesting thing in the research and was also hearing about the Kennewick Man and all the controversy is that how much white supremacists really sort of lobbed on and jumped on to scientific theories about where the Kennewick Man came from. And some of that in the video would be the Asatru Folk Assembly, which is like a white supremacist group that traces its origins back to Norway and saying that settlers have been here long before Native Americans. Just interesting the ways in which, that sort of thinking actually really, undergirds science to this day still.
Of course, and clinging to science and positioning oneself as scientific obviously, implies some kind of absolute truth, when your video very much is testimony to the fact that science and truth are by no means necessarily intrinsically linked. So thank you for this answer. Akram, I also wanted to ask you if you can situate your video in relation to the Arab Image Foundation, and particularly the concept of radical preservation, which I find extremely fascinating. I hope that you can tell us what that means and what the significance is for you, radical preservation.
In most conservation institutes, the idea of preservation is centered on material.
Mhm.
Although the idea of preservation, I think, as a dream, man's dream, is to preserve life, to preserve desire, to preserve things that are scientifically fleeting, materially fleeting, one cannot catch. So why do we, I always like to give an example of a music partition. If you want to preserve a music partition, you need to keep on performing it. It doesn't, you don't take that written partition, consider it as ink and paper, and put it in a fridge away from access. So from that perspective, I started to think of how important the element of performance is in the conservation of ideas. Teaching, for example, is about transferring ideas by conserving them.
It's a lot like what Zack mentioned too about the sort of oral traditions and passing things on. Not everything can just be written and that's it. You have to kind of keep
most importantly is not fearing that they get modified by others. Whereas scientific measures of conservation are too strict, they want blind people, in the sense like people that don't question anything, that just consider preservation from a tiny perspective, as opposed to a question. Preservation is a question. One needs to answer it based on what is to be preserved and what's its value, what's its function, how was it produced, what it is for, and then one decides how to preserve it. And that that decision is not a scientific; is a very personal, creative decision. And I like to use a lot Yoko Ogawa's amazing novel about a conservation institute, where a man conserves all sorts of things for clients, and he does exactly this. He decides to make performances with all the remains that are brought to him, and those it becomes like theater. It becomes performance. It takes the idea of conservation away from scientists and give it to creative people, simply.
That's wonderful. So you consider yourself also a conservationist, but in a much broader sense of the term.
Exactly. I use tools that are provided to me, like Zack mentioned as well, like film. I work a lot with film and photography, but I stopped calling myself a filmmaker, to be honest, because writers don't call themselves pencil artists or pen artists. So I'm not a film artist. I'm a writer that writes with film and video, and my ultimate aim is history. I'm interested in engaging with history. My tools are coming from the art world, namely videos and performances, but my ambition is elsewhere.
Thank you. Well, Laura and Niklas are also, in a sense, conservationists, maybe of a historical etymology. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you encountered this etymological history of the falcon, how also you encountered the twins, Laverne and Loretta. I'm sure that everyone who watched or is about to watch the film would love to know that. And I have another question too, but I'll ask that one later. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like Laura said, I had taken my son up on Thanksgiving, I think, to Amicalola Falls, which is the site where we ended up meeting the twins. And before we made the film, or even were thinking about this, our work, kind of, we have parallels in terms of experimental documentary and conceptually based work, and we're academics and overthink things, that type of, so this was a very different kind of road that we literally flowed on. And so when we got these prompts, and I guess to back up, when we went up, there were these birders who were showing these falcons. And just to be clear, Georgia's football team is the Atlanta Falcons. And I don't think Laura and I are either very big sports fans and have looked at gender and pulled apart sports and other and kind of that traditional performance. So out came this falcon, and my son was riveted, but I was listening, to what she was saying, and she said, really it's a female bird and we don't call it a falcon, it's a tercel. And I have a dad who's a biologist. I grew up he's a bird whisperer and all this. I had never heard that distinction. So it stuck in my head. And then she started making fun of the Atlanta Falcons football team, kind of because a falcon is a female bird versus a tercel is a male bird. I kind of flipped that a second ago. But, and I was like, oh, so really the team should be women on the field or something else. And so that just, as filmmakers, as artists, those narratives stick in your head. And then when we pulled these prompts out, I was like, oh, there was this moment when we were spitballing very fast, very differently than we normally work. I threw this out there and we ran with it. And I had only met one person. And when we got up there, I had spoken with Loretta. We had contacted her and said, are you down for playing with us? And talking about, the gender kind of commentary that she made before. And we showed up and met her, and she pulled out the bird, the falcon, and then her twin walks in the room, and we're like, oh my gosh, there's two of them. And, those are the things in nonfiction, right, that you can't script. Just like the guy on the horse picking up Budweiser at the gas station who we ran into. And, the fact that my partner at the time had a Toyota Tercel that was underpowered, just like the Atlanta Falcons football team and things. So all this just started unraveling in beautiful ways for us. And
That's
we just,
awesome. I love
we
that
just
story.
rolled with it. Yeah, so it was really, and then the twins had such a great kind of dynamic. We just rolled with it. We wrote that petition, ahead of time, and then they helped us rewrite it and re-performed it for the camera. So they were great.
That's a wonderful moment in the video.
Yeah.
I'm so curious to know how you think the Atlanta Falcons would have responded if they had seen it, or maybe they will see it. What do you think will happen if they do?
Well, this was made before social media. I was just thinking, if we had made this yesterday, we would probably have put this out on YouTube or, on our social media channels and sent it out that way already. But at the time, there was like a fan chat group online or something, probably not even on Facebook. I don't really even remember. And we had posted it there, but I think it only received a couple of comments from fans. Hey, you're right, or I never knew that, or that's very funny. And that was kind of it, right? Unless you can remember anything else, Niklas.
Well, the only other thing I remember is within the International Documentary Challenge, they had a competition, the best of the year films, remember? And you and I put the film out there and, in a social media way, crowdsourced votes. And
right.
I remember a couple of my friends thinking it was hilarious and they hadn't thought about it. And then there were a couple people like, making fun of football in the South is kind of like speaking badly about somebody's mother, or parent or whatever. So there were a couple people that were really like, this isn't funny, you shouldn't go there, it's like blasphemous. So I had a couple of those responses from friends that I had no idea.
Totally. Zach, what kind of responses did you get for your video? I imagine very different responses from different sides. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely different responses from different sides. I mean, like I was saying too, me and my brother have been working on this larger film about repatriation, working really closely with the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation Repatriation Alliance, for a lot of tribal representatives who do this work. And so this film, we were able to show to them as sort of a proof of concept about how we're willing to approach the subject matter, especially like the necessity of not actually showing the actual ancestors is like a really big ethical part of creating work about this. But then on the flip side, I was frankly pretty surprised the video also went to Sundance and was a Vimeo staff pick. So there was like a lot of sort of social media comments and responses. And there was a lot of really upset, and I think I would say like museum professionals generally, because I think the film in some ways, you know, draws criticism to the idea that museums are sort of, you know, forces of good exclusively. Yeah, and so I think a lot of people read it as a takedown of a museum as a concept or in science as a concept. And so there's actually a surprising amount of like vitriolic responses that made people really angry, which was really eye-opening for me because the case sort of speaks for itself, you know, it's mostly just stating the facts. So in that sense, you know, I do hear, especially with younger museum professionals, younger archaeologists, there is a big change in the field of people being more sensitive and being more aware. But I think also on the whole, the field has a lot of work to do still to change opinions and thoughts.
Thank
and
you.
That was tough to witness that.
And speaking of ethics, Akram, you mentioned earlier that there's an ethical challenge when it comes to uncovering things. And so is there not then also an ethical challenge in terms of deciding what to preserve and what not to preserve, whether it's physical objects or ideas? How do you respond to that?
Sure. The question for me is always a very subjective one. I'm not a scientist. Science is a tool. It's not our guiding force. Our values are our guiding force, and we know very well that values change over time. I mean, every 50 years, let's say every few decades, there is a new set of values that get to dominate. And in the light of those values, one needs to decide about ethical questions, what to publish, what not to publish, what do you have a license for, what are you authorized to do given contractually, because also working with photography is working with documents that are most likely 100 and 120 years old. We don't have around us photographs from the early 19th century. Photography is the invention of the mid-19th century. Some of those documents became public domain, and therefore we can work freely with them, whether we know who is in them or not. But for photographs from the 50s that we've taken from family albums, I mean, there's a set of values that needs to guide an artist. There's no Bible for those.
Of course.
I just wanted to take those documents away from scientists, honestly.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. Do you have any questions for each other?
I can't wait to watch these films. I mean, we can watch them, right? On YouTube, right?
Yes, exactly. All of them are already up except for Laura and Niklas's, which will be up immediately following this screening, or this conversation. So thank you so much for joining me. I have to, we've hit our time limit and Lisa is back. So thank you again. So happy to talk with all of you.
Well, I want to thank each of you for your work. It's and Ivana for your curatorial vision, which you were looking for things like humor, and you found it. You were looking for this notion of the uncovering, and I think you found some really great works to be part of your program. And the final title, if I'm going to ask everyone who's tuned in tonight, the final title, which is Unfettering the Falcons, which we heard a little bit about from Laura and Niklas, will follow immediately after we sign off. And you just scroll down and you will hit the little triangle to play the work. And Ivana's program, all four of the titles, will be up until Friday. You can watch it all together or individually as you want, but you can see it until Friday, December 11th at 7 p.m. when we launch program number 5. So in the curatorial incubator. So, but we will really look forward to seeing everybody again. We hope when we are on the other side of this. Thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the inclusion. Nice to meet you
Thank you
all.
much for having us. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Bye, Laura.
Bye.
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 Okay.
Bye.